The San Diego Padres were the model franchise. They had a waiting list for season tickets, a payroll rivaling the New York Yankees, and a roster built to win the World Series. Then, almost overnight, everything stopped. They traded Juan Soto, a generational talent, and slashed their payroll by nearly $100 million. The narrative you heard on ESPN was that the owners suddenly got cheap. Fans screamed that ownership was trying to save a buck. But that is a lie. The reality is much darker. The Padres didn't choose to stop spending. They were forced to liquidate assets by a specific little-known financial regulation that is quietly pushing teams toward the auction block. We are breaking down the interaction between debt caps, the luxury tax, and the regional sports network collapse to show why your favorite team might be next. To understand why a team with sold-out crowds suddenly fires its best players, you have to look at the debt service rule. This is the invisible hand guiding MLB front offices. The regulation effectively caps a team's debt at roughly 8 to 10 times their EBITDA. That's earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. The league claims this rule exists to ensure financial stability. They want to prevent a repeat of the 2010 Texas Rangers disaster, where the team actually went bankrupt and had to be auctioned off in a court proceeding. On paper, it makes sense. Don't let owners leverage the team into oblivion. But in practice, it creates a trap for any owner who isn't a billionaire with massive liquidity. Here is how the trap snapped shut on San Diego. Under late owner Peter Seidler, the Padres spent aggressively. They pushed their payroll past $250 million to compete with the Dodgers. Seidler financed much of this spending through debt, betting that high ticket sales and postseason revenue would cover the costs. For a while, it worked. The team was exciting, the stadium was full, and the revenue was flowing. Then the trigger event happened. The regional sports network model collapsed. Diamond Sports Group, which operates the Bally Sports networks, filed for bankruptcy. This wiped out guaranteed revenue streams for multiple teams, including the Padres. This is where the math gets brutal. The debt service rule is a ratio. It measures your debt against your earnings. When the RSN money disappeared, the E and EBITDA, the earnings dropped significantly. Even though the Padres' actual debt amount hadn't changed, their debt-to-earnings ratio spiked instantly because the denominator got smaller. Suddenly, the Padres were in violation of the debt service rule. It wasn't that Seidler ran out of money personally, it was that the team's balance sheet no longer complied with MLB regulations. When you violate this rule, the league intervenes. They mandate that you get back in compliance, and the fastest way to do that is to cut costs immediately. This forced the front office's hand. They had to shed salary to lower expenses and try to stabilize that earnings ratio. The Juan Soto trade wasn't a baseball decision, it was a compliance decision. The dismantling of a contender was the direct result of a financial covenant designed to protect the game. But this debt trap is only half the problem. If you try to spend your way out of this hole by signing better players to increase revenue, you run into the second wall, the penalty for spending money you don't have. The system is rigged so that once you fall into this debt spiral, the only way out is to sell off your stars, or in some cases, sell the team entirely. You might be thinking that if a team is drowning in debt, the solution is simple. Just earn more money by winning more games. But the league has constructed a second financial wall that makes spending your way out of debt mathematically impossible for anyone but the ultra-wealthy. This wall is the competitive balance tax, or CBT. While fans call it the luxury tax, that name implies it's a fee for buying nice things. In reality, it is a suffocating progressive penalty system designed to strip the profit margin away from any team that tries to grow too fast. For the 2025 season, the initial tax threshold is set at $241 million. If a team's payroll exceeds that number, the penalties begin. In the first year, you pay a 20% tax on the overage. If you do it a second year in a row, it jumps to 30%. By the third year, you are handing over 50% of every dollar spent above the line. But the base tax is just the beginning. The system includes aggressive surcharges for teams that blow past the limit significantly. If a team exceeds the threshold by $20 million to $40 million, the league adds a 12% surcharge. If they go $60 million over, the surcharge can skyrocket to 60%. When you combine the repeat offender penalties with the maximum surcharges, A team like the Mets or Dodgers can face an effective tax rate of over 90% on their top-tier spending. For every dollar they pay a superstar, they must pay nearly another dollar to the league. This creates a massive disparity that breaks the competitive balance the rule claims to protect. For a juggernaut like the Los Angeles Dodgers, who generate over $500 million in annual revenue, a $5 million tax bill is simply an operating expense, the cost of doing business to ensure a World Series run. They can absorb the hit because their local revenue streams are massive. However, for a mid-market team, that same $50 million tax bill doesn't just hurt, it wipes out their entire annual operating profit. We have seen this movie before, and we know exactly how it ends. The historical precedent for the current crisis is the New York Mets under the Wilpon family. Before billionaire Steve Cohen bought the team, the Wilpons were the perfect example of how the debt service rule and market pressure create a zombie franchise. The Wilpons were heavily invested with Bernie Madoff. When Madoff's Ponzi scheme collapsed, the family faced a massive liquidity crisis. Suddenly, the Mets were in a position where they desperately needed revenue to service their non-baseball debts, but they couldn't afford the payroll required to field a winning team. Their debt-to-EBITDA ratio skyrocketed, violating the league's debt service rules. This violation gave Major League Baseball the authority to intervene. The league effectively forced the Wilpons to take emergency loans to stay afloat, but those loans came with strings attached that eventually necessitated a sale. The Wilpons held on as long as they could, slashing payroll and alienating fans, but the structural trap was inescapable. They eventually sold to Steve Cohen for $2.4 billion. The lesson from the Wilpons and now the Padres is that the system is designed to punish the middle class of owners. Only two types of ownership groups can survive this structure: those with zero debt who refuse to spend, and those with such massive non-baseball wealth that the losses don't matter. If you are a millionaire owner trying to compete with billionaire owners using leverage, the tax and debt rules will eventually force you to hand over the keys. If you cannot afford to pay the tax, the system offers you one alternative strategy: stop trying to win altogether. This is the path chosen by John Fisher in the Oakland Athletics. Instead of leveraging debt to compete, Fisher stripped the roster down to the studs. His goal was to stay profitable by collecting revenue-sharing checks. In MLB, 48% of all local net revenues are pooled and distributed equally among the teams. This means that profitable teams like the Yankees and Red Sox are effectively subsidizing the payrolls of teams like the Athletics. For years, owners like Fisher treated this as a steady income stream, running their franchises like lean startups rather than sports teams. But even this tanking model has a fatal flaw in the current economy. The flaw is that even low payroll teams eventually need to build infrastructure, and infrastructure requires debt. The A's relocation saga to Las Vegas has exposed this crack in the foundation. Even with a stripped-down payroll, the funding gap for a new stadium forces the ownership group to take on debt, which immediately brings the debt service rule back into play. You cannot escape the ratio. If your revenue is low because you alienated your fan base, your borrowing power is virtually zero. This creates a valuation paradox that is reshaping the entire league. The strict financial rules make it nearly impossible for traditional sports families or mere millionaires to operate these teams profitably during downturns. Yet because these franchises are scarce assets, their paper value continues to skyrocket. This disconnect implies that the only logical financial move for a struggling owner is to sell. We are seeing the fallout of this paradox accelerated by the RSN crisis, with local TV revenue down 20% across the league due to the cord-cutting revolution and the Bally Sports bankruptcy. The EBITDA for almost every team has taken a hit. This means that technical defaults on the debt service rule are likely happening quietly across the league, not just in San Diego. The league office knows this, and they are facilitating a consolidation of power. The result is a massive transfer of assets from legacy sports families to institutional investors, hedge fund managers, and private equity groups. Look at the recent sale of the Baltimore Orioles. The Angelos family, who held the team for decades, sold the franchise for $1.725 billion to a group led by private equity billionaire David Rubenstein. This is the new normal. The family business era of baseball is dying because the math no longer supports it. The rules intended to create competitive balance have ironically ensured that only the ultra-wealthy can hold on to franchises during economic downturns. The system acts as a filter, shaking out the smaller owners whenever the economy wobbles. It turns temporary revenue dips into permanent exit strategies, ensuring that the next generation of owners will treat these teams not as civic institutions, but as diversified assets in a high-yield portfolio. The debt service rule acts as a silent tripwire that turns revenue dips into forced sales. While fans waste their energy blaming owners for being cheap, the reality is that the league's own financial structure makes sustained spending mathematically impossible for anyone outside the top 1% of wealth holders. If you want to understand how the NFL's salary cap creates a completely different set of problems for its owners, watch this video next. Subscribe for more sports business analysis.